He owned half the city, but in that moment, he couldn't buy his way out of what he was seeing. The girl standing in the ashes of her home was about to cost him more than $1 billion. Daniel Whitmore was used to glass towers and private elevators that rose 40 stories in under a minute, used to boardrooms where men in tailored suits measured land in acres and profits in quarterly returns. But he was not used to standing on a cracked sidewalk at the edge of Harbor District, breathing in the bitter scent of smoke that still lingered in the cool March air. The morning sun climbed slowly over the skyline, casting pale gold light across what used to be a narrow 2-bedroom house with white siding and a sagging porch barely 6 feet deep. Now it was nothing but blackened beams and scattered bricks. Emily Carter stood in the middle of it, all arms wrapped tightly around herself, her thrift store sweater dusted in gray powder, her long blonde hair tangled by the wind rolling in from the river. She couldn't have been more than 19. A single duffel bag rested near her feet, the kind that held everything when everything else was gone. Daniel had come to inspect the redevelopment site, a 12-acre project projected to generate 8 figures in its first year alone, but the numbers on his tablet no longer made sense against the sight of her trembling shoulders. She wasn't loud. She wasn't dramatic. She just stood there staring at the remains of the only place she had ever called home, as if willing it to rebuild itself. And for the first time in years, Daniel Whitmore felt something inside his chest that no financial forecast had ever prepared him for. The wind shifted and carried a thin swirl of ash across Daniel's polished shoes, dulling the shine that had reflected boardroom chandeliers only hours earlier. He did not move to brush it away. A small crowd had gathered along the sidewalk, neighbors wrapped in heavy coats, whispering in low voices about insurance claims and temporary shelters set up 3 miles west at a middle school gymnasium. Daniel's driver waited beside the black sedan parked at the curb, engine running heat, humming softly against the 40-degree morning. Daniel barely heard it. His attention stayed fixed on the girl. Emily knelt carefully and lifted something from the rubble, a framed photograph smudged with soot. She wiped the glass with the sleeve of her sweater, slow and deliberate, as if the gentleness of the motion could protect what little remained. For a second her composure cracked. Her chin trembled. She inhaled sharply, fighting tears that had already fallen. Daniel felt the weight of a realization settle over him, like the cold air pressing against his coat. The land beneath her feet had been approved for demolition permits 6 weeks earlier. His signature sat on the authorization page. He had studied zoning maps and profit margins measured in square footage and projected rent per unit, never once picturing a 19-year-old standing exactly where the new parking structure was designed to rise. When Emily finally looked up, her eyes locked onto the logo stitched onto the chest of his tailored overcoat, the emblem of Whitmore Development, unmistakable even through the dust. Recognition flickered across her face, and the space between them tightened with something far heavier than silence. Emily rose slowly to her feet, still clutching the photograph against her chest, as if it were fragile glass instead of a cheap wooden frame bought at a discount store years ago. Her eyes did not look confused. They looked certain that the man standing 10 feet away, in a tailored charcoal coat and Italian leather shoes, did not belong in this neighborhood unless he was the reason it no longer looked the same. Daniel felt the unspoken accusation before she said a single word. The Harbor District had been labeled blighted, in reports described as underutilized land, less than 2 miles from downtown Prime for transformation. But standing there now, he could see what the paperwork had never shown him. Faded blue shutters someone had once painted by hand, a tire swing hanging from a maple tree that still stood at the edge of the property, a garden bed outlined with uneven stones. This had not been empty land. It had been a life measured in small, ordinary details. Emily's voice, when it finally came, was steady despite the redness in her eyes. She asked him if he was proud of what his company had done. The question did not rise above a normal speaking tone, yet it landed harder than any public criticism he had ever faced. Around them, a few neighbors stopped whispering and turned to listen. Daniel opened his mouth to explain permits and city approvals and insurance policies, but the words felt hollow before they even formed. For the first time in years, Daniel Whitmore did not sound like the most powerful man in the room. He sounded like someone who suddenly understood that a signature on a page could erase a family history in less than 12 hours. Daniel felt every pair of eyes along Harbor District pressing into his back as if the entire street had turned into a courtroom without walls. Emily did not raise her voice, but the steadiness of it carried further than shouting ever could. She told him her father had spent 27 years repairing engines in a garage 4 miles south of here, that he had paid off the mortgage inch by inch, that the house might have been small at 900 square feet, but it was theirs. She said the fire department had ruled the blaze accidental and electrical fault in wiring older than she was, and she almost laughed at the irony that the city had already scheduled the block for clearance within weeks. Daniel listened, his jaw tight, knowing the redevelopment timeline had accelerated pressure on residents to vacate. The permits had been legal. The meetings had been public. But legality did not sound the same as fairness when spoken over the remains of a porch that once held summer barbecues and folding chairs. He finally stepped closer, closing half the distance between them, careful not to invade her space. He told her he was sorry. The words felt insufficient the moment they left his mouth. Emily's gaze dropped briefly to the Whitmore development emblem stitched over his heart. She asked him if sorry could rebuild a roof before the next rainstorm, if sorry could replace the photographs still buried under splintered beams. A news van rolled slowly onto the street, parking 20 yards away, a camera already pointed in their direction. Daniel's driver shifted uneasily beside the sedan. This was the moment he usually retreated, issued a statement through public relations, and moved on to the next project. Instead, he remained standing in the cold March air less than 10 feet from a young woman who had nothing left to lose, aware that whatever he chose to do next would not stay confined to this quiet neighborhood. The red recording light on the news camera blinked steadily, a silent reminder that this moment was already escaping the boundaries of Harbor District. Daniel could almost hear the headlines forming in real time, the speculation, the commentary about corporate greed and displaced families. His public relations team would be calling within minutes if they had not already seen the live feed. Emily noticed the camera too, but she did not adjust her posture or soften her expression. She stood exactly as she was, shoulders squared, smoke lingering in the air behind her like a fading memory. Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a business card, thick cream stock, with his name embossed in understated lettering. He extended it toward her, offering immediate housing assistance through one of his company's luxury apartment units less than 2 miles away, fully furnished utilities covered for a year. It was a solution he could execute with a single phone call. Emily looked at the card, but did not take it. She asked him if he thought she wanted charity inside one of the buildings that replaced her neighborhood. The question struck harder than her earlier accusation. A gust of wind lifted loose ash and carried it across the sidewalk, brushing against Daniel's coat like a quiet rebuke. For a moment, he felt the reflex to retreat, to step back into the insulated world of controlled outcomes and managed risk. Instead, he lowered the card slowly. He realized this was not about square footage or temporary shelter measured in 12-month leases. This was about dignity, about roots, about a 19-year-old who did not want to be relocated like a line item on a spreadsheet. The silence between them stretched long enough for the distant hum of traffic from the interstate barely half a mile away to fill the gap. And Daniel understood that whatever he chose next could not be small. Daniel let his hand fall back to his side, the untouched business card still between his fingers, suddenly feeling lighter than paper and heavier than steel at the same time. He looked past Emily for a moment, taking in the entire block that had once held 12 modest homes along a stretch of less than 300 yards. Some houses were boarded up, others already vacant, windows dark and hollow. Yellow city notices flapped loosely against siding in the wind. Harbor District had been described in development meetings as underperforming property within a 5-mile radius of downtown's fastest-growing corridor. Standing there now, Daniel could see front steps worn smooth by decades of use, mailboxes dented but decorated with faded family names, and driveways no wider than 10 feet where children had once learned to ride bicycles. This was not underperforming land. It was lived in. Emily spoke again, her voice quieter but firmer, explaining that she had been saving for community college classes starting in the fall, that she worked 30 hours a week at a diner 2 miles north, that she had planned to fix the roof herself once she could afford new shingles. She was not asking him for rescue. She was asking him to understand that her life had direction before this morning. Daniel felt the familiar vibration of his phone in his coat pocket. He did not need to look to know it was his chief financial officer, or perhaps a board member, who had seen the news van arrive. The project represented nearly $200 million in projected revenue over the next 5 years. Investors were expecting groundbreaking within 60 days. Delays would ripple through contracts, partnerships, stock value. He thought about the conference room on the 38th floor of his headquarters, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river, the applause when the redevelopment plan had been approved unanimously. That applause felt distant now. He met Emily's eyes again, and realized the decision forming inside him would not fit neatly into any quarterly report. It would demand something personal, something irreversible, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel Whitmore hesitated, not because he feared losing money, but because he feared discovering who he truly was without it. The vibration in Daniel's pocket did not stop. It pulsed again and again, persistent, insistent, like the world he belonged to refusing to wait. Around them, the small crowd began to thin as neighbors returned to their own uncertain mornings, but the news camera remained fixed, capturing every second of stillness between a billionaire and a 19-year-old girl with nothing left but a duffel bag and a photograph. Emily glanced toward the city notice stapled to what remained of her front fence, the bold letters declaring the property condemned and scheduled for clearance within 48 hours. Even after the fire, the timeline had not changed. A demolition crew would arrive with heavy equipment measured in tons ready to level what little stood. She explained that the temporary shelter was already full by midnight, that she had slept in her car parked 3 blocks away where the streetlight flickered every few seconds. Her voice did not break when she said it. That steadiness unsettled Daniel more than tears would have. He imagined her alone in a compact sedan barely 12 feet long, the March temperature dipping below 40 degrees, overnight windows fogged from her breath. His phone finally fell silent, only to light up again with a message preview from his chief financial officer, warning that halting construction would trigger penalty clauses worth millions. Daniel understood the language of contracts. He understood leverage. But he also understood that the permits had been rushed through a council meeting held at 9 in the morning on a weekday when most residents were at work. Legally compliant did not mean morally clear. Emily told him she had received a relocation offer equal to 3 months of average rent in the area, an amount that would barely cover deposits and moving costs. She said it felt less like assistance and more like eviction with paperwork. Daniel looked at the skyline rising less than 2 miles away, cranes cutting across the horizon, steel and glass promising progress. Then he looked back at the ashes at his feet. The distance between those 2 images measured less than 10 minutes by car, yet it felt like a divide measured in lifetimes, and the clock was already ticking. Daniel finally pulled his phone from his pocket, not to answer it, but to silence it completely. The screen was crowded with missed calls and urgent messages, each one representing a board member, an investor, or an executive whose world revolved around projections and deadlines. He turned the device face down in his palm, as if muting it could quiet the pressure building behind his ribs. Emily noticed the gesture. She seemed surprised, not softened, but curious that he had chosen not to step away. A city inspector approached from across the street, clipboard in hand, reminding her that the site would be fenced off by sunset for safety compliance. Sunset was less than 8 hours away. The words hung in the air like a countdown. Emily nodded politely, but her fingers tightened around the strap of her duffel bag. Daniel asked where she planned to go tonight. She hesitated before admitting she did not know. The shelter had a waiting list. Her closest relative lived nearly 800 miles away in Ohio, and she did not have enough saved for gas and lodging to make the drive. Her car, a 10-year-old sedan with over 150,000 miles on it, was reliable, but not limitless. Daniel calculated the distance, automatically estimating fuel costs, motel rates, the risk of breaking down halfway. These were not numbers in a spreadsheet. They were miles of uncertainty. Across the street, a construction supervisor from Whitmore Development arrived in a pickup truck, clearly uncomfortable, seeing his employer standing in conversation with a resident in front of cameras. He approached Daniel cautiously and reminded him that equipment rental fees were already active, and crews were scheduled to begin clearing debris within 48 hours. Delays would cost thousands per day. Daniel looked at the blackened beams again, at the faint outline of where a living room once stood, and realized that time, not money, was the sharpest pressure in the room. Every passing hour narrowed Emily's options. Every passing hour forced him closer to a decision that would define far more than a project timeline. The construction supervisor cleared his throat and shifted his weight, clearly aware that the longer this conversation continued, the more complicated the situation became. He reminded Daniel that contracts had already been signed with 2 major retail chains and a residential developer from out-of-state agreements that depended on this land being cleared on schedule. Breaking or even pausing those contracts would not only cost money, but credibility. Daniel listened without interrupting, his eyes drifting back to Emily, who stood motionless beside the remnants of her front steps, as if anchoring herself to the last recognizable piece of her past. The news reporter across the street began speaking into a microphone, summarizing the redevelopment project and mentioning projected job creation numbers, citing figures in the thousands. Daniel knew those numbers by heart. He had presented them himself at investor conferences. But numbers felt abstract compared to the reality in front of him. Emily finally spoke again, asking the supervisor if anyone from the company had ever walked through the neighborhood without a clipboard, without a blueprint, just to see who actually lived here. The supervisor did not answer. Daniel felt a flicker of discomfort because he knew the truth. Community meetings had been held, but they were structured, timed, efficient. Feedback was documented, categorized, and weighed against financial viability. Human stories were reduced to bullet points. His phone buzzed once more with a direct call from the chairman of the board. This time he answered. He stepped only a few feet away, not out of earshot, but far enough to speak in a lower tone. The chairman's voice was controlled yet firm, reminding him that investors were monitoring the live coverage, that hesitation would be interpreted as instability. The message was clear: proceed as planned. Daniel ended the call without committing to anything. When he turned back, Emily was watching him with an expression that was no longer angry, but resolute. She told him that by sunset, the fence would go up, and by the end of the week, there would be nothing left to remember her father, by except what she carried in that single duffel bag. The air felt heavier, as if the approaching afternoon pressed down on all of them. Daniel understood that the next words he spoke would not only determine the fate of 12 acres of land, but would signal to everyone watching whether he was defined by profit margins or by something far less measurable. And for the first time in his career, the answer was not immediately clear. Daniel stood very still after ending the call, the chairman's final words echoing in his mind like a verdict already decided. Proceed as planned. Protect investor confidence. Do not let emotion disrupt strategy. He had heard variations of that advice for nearly 20 years. It was the language that built his empire, the discipline that turned small acquisitions into towering developments across 3 states. Yet as he looked at the remains of Emily's home, something inside him refused to translate her loss into acceptable collateral damage. He asked her quietly how long her family had lived on this block. She told him her father had moved in when he was 23, that he had planted the maple tree by the sidewalk the same summer she was born. She pointed to the charred edge of the yard and said there used to be a wooden bench there where they drank lemonade on humid evenings when the temperature climbed above 90 degrees in July. Daniel listened, and without meaning to, he saw a different memory overlay the scene. He saw a small house from his own childhood, not nearly as worn down, but modest all the same, located on a narrow street in a factory town nearly 200 miles from here. He remembered the year his father lost his job when the plant shut down, remembered the tension that filled their kitchen when bills stacked up beside the refrigerator. They had not lost their home, but he remembered the fear of it, the way his mother kept the porch light on every night, as if guarding against uncertainty. That fear had fueled his ambition. He had sworn he would never stand powerless in front of a notice that threatened everything. And now he realized he had become the signature on that notice for someone else. The realization unsettled him more than the chairman's warning. The construction supervisor approached again, asking for final confirmation to proceed with debris clearance within 48 hours. Daniel did not answer immediately. He studied the ground, calculating not profits this time, but consequences. If he halted the project even temporarily, stock prices could dip within days. Investors might withdraw. The board could move to replace him as chief executive. He could lose the very company he built. Emily waited, her expression calm but expectant, as if she sensed that this pause carried more weight than any press statement. Daniel understood that he was no longer deciding between efficiency and delay. He was deciding between the version of himself shaped by fear decades ago and the version he might become if he chose differently now. The afternoon light shifted, stretching longer shadows across the broken foundation, as if the day itself was leaning in to witness his decision. Daniel inhaled slowly, the air still carrying a faint trace of smoke, mixed with the distant scent of gasoline from passing traffic half a mile away. He asked the construction supervisor for a full copy of every relocation agreement issued to residents on this block, including compensation breakdowns and timelines. The supervisor looked surprised, but nodded, saying he could have digital files sent within the hour. Emily watched this exchange carefully, not hopeful yet, but no longer dismissive. Daniel then asked her a question he should have asked weeks ago, whether anyone from his company had personally reviewed her father's property after the fire to assess structural viability before condemning it permanently. She shook her head and said an inspector had spent less than 15 minutes walking through the debris with a clipboard before posting the notice. 15 minutes to close a chapter that had lasted nearly 2 decades. Daniel felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with cold air. He imagined what 15 minutes meant in his world, the time it took to skim a proposal, to approve a marketing budget, to move millions of dollars with a digital signature. Here, 15 minutes had erased a home. His phone lit up again with a message from Investor Relations warning that financial analysts were requesting clarification on rumors of project instability. The word instability lingered in his mind. To the market, instability meant risk. To Emily, instability meant sleeping in a car with the temperature dropping below 40 degrees at night. The definitions were worlds apart. Daniel stepped closer to the remains of the porch and looked down at the charred outline where floorboards had once met the front door. He realized that if he allowed the demolition to proceed immediately, the physical evidence of this family's history would disappear within days, making every conversation afterward feel abstract. He turned back to Emily and told her he needed time not as a tactic, but as a commitment to reassess everything about how this project had been executed. The words were cautious, not dramatic, yet they carried weight. The news camera captured his expression, no longer polished for investors, but unsettled and searching. Daniel understood that requesting time might already be seen as defiance by his board. But for the first time since arriving that morning, he felt certain of one thing rushing forward, would cost more than any financial penalty he could calculate. The word time lingered between them, fragile and uncertain, as if even that promise could evaporate under corporate pressure. Emily studied Daniel carefully, searching his face for signs that this was another polished reassurance meant to quiet the cameras. She asked him how much time he believed she had before the fence went up and security locked the perimeter. Daniel glanced toward the city inspector, who confirmed that by municipal order, the property would be restricted by sunset, unless the developer formally requested a temporary hold. Sunset was less than 7 hours away. Daniel understood what that meant. A hold required written notice, legal justification, and board acknowledgement. It would trigger questions immediately. He could already imagine the emergency meeting, the tension across a 20-foot conference table, the subtle shift in tone as confidence turned into doubt. Yet he also understood that if he did nothing before the sun dropped below the skyline, this block would become inaccessible, and with it any chance to review what had been lost. Emily told him she had planned to retrieve a metal box her father kept under the hallway floorboards, containing old letters and documents that were not replaceable. She had not been allowed back inside after the fire department finished their inspection. The thought that memories measured in paper and ink might be buried under debris tightened Daniel's resolve. He turned to the construction supervisor and instructed him clearly and without hesitation to pause all activity on this specific property until further notice. The supervisor's expression shifted from confusion to alarm, but Daniel did not soften the directive. He then called his legal counsel, directly requesting immediate paperwork to file for a temporary suspension of demolition pending structural reassessment. As he spoke, the news camera zoomed closer, capturing the moment his voice changed from uncertain to decisive. Emily did not smile, but something in her posture eased slightly, as if a fraction of the weight on her shoulders had lifted. Daniel knew this was only the beginning. Pausing one property would not satisfy investors, and it would not automatically protect the entire block. But as the afternoon sun angled lower and the light turned warmer against the ruins, he recognized that he had crossed an invisible line. For the first time in his career, he had chosen to interrupt momentum instead of accelerate it, and there would be consequences waiting for him on the other side of that choice. Within 20 minutes of issuing the suspension, Daniel's phone began ringing again, this time with a frequency that felt less like concern and more like alarm. The chairman did not mask his frustration. He demanded to know why demolition had been halted without full board approval, and reminded Daniel that investor confidence could drop within hours if uncertainty spread. Daniel stood on the cracked sidewalk, the late afternoon sun dipping lower behind the skyline, and listened without interrupting. He explained that structural reassessment was necessary, that relocation terms required review, that proceeding under current optics would expose the company to reputational damage far exceeding any short-term delay. The chairman responded that reputation was already under scrutiny precisely because Daniel had hesitated publicly. The conversation ended not with agreement, but with a warning that an emergency board meeting would convene within the hour. Daniel knew what that meant. His leadership would be questioned. His authority would be tested. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and exhaled slowly. Across the street, the news reporter summarized the development in real time, framing it as a dramatic shift in a multi-million-dollar project. Emily remained near the remnants of her home, watching him with cautious attention. Daniel walked back toward her and told her plainly that he had paused not only her property, but requested a temporary review of the entire 12-acre block. He did not promise outcomes. He promised scrutiny. Emily absorbed the words in silence, then asked him what it would cost him. The question landed deeper than she intended. He considered the numbers: automatically penalties measured in millions, stock volatility measured in percentage points, potential removal from his own executive seat measured in votes. Then he answered honestly. It could cost him control of his company. It could cost him the empire he had spent 2 decades building. Emily's expression shifted not into gratitude, but into something closer to understanding. She told him her father used to say that a person finds out who they are when something important is at risk. The sky above Harbor District turned shades of orange and deepening blue, and Daniel realized the sun would set whether he protected his position or not. The difference was whether he would recognize the man standing in the reflection of the glass towers tomorrow morning. For the first time, the fear of losing power felt smaller than the fear of keeping it at someone else's expense. The emergency board meeting began before the sun fully disappeared, faces appearing one by one on Daniel's screen as he sat in the back seat of his car, parked along the curb of Harbor District. Glass towers glowed in the distance less than 2 miles away, symbols of everything he had built. The chairman spoke first, his tone controlled but unmistakably sharp, stating that the suspension had already triggered a 5% dip in after-hours trading. Several board members questioned Daniel's judgment, reminding him that large-scale redevelopment required firm execution, not public hesitation. Daniel listened as projections were cited, penalty clauses outlined, investor sentiment analyzed in precise financial language. When it was his turn to speak, he did not raise his voice. He described the relocation packages offered to residents, the accelerated timelines, the optics of fencing off a block within hours of a fire, the 15-minute inspection that condemned a home that had stood for nearly 2 decades. He acknowledged the financial risks, then added something none of them expected. He said the greater risk was becoming a company that measured success solely in square footage and quarterly returns, while ignoring the human cost embedded in every blueprint. Silence followed. One director accused him of letting emotion cloud strategy. Daniel responded that strategy without conscience was short-sighted, especially in an era where transparency traveled faster than any construction crew. He then made a decision that shifted the entire tone of the meeting. He offered to personally absorb the financial penalties associated with a full 90-day halt on the Harbor District project by reallocating a portion of his own equity stake. The number he mentioned was substantial enough to protect investor dividends during the pause. Gasps filled the call. The chairman warned him that reducing his equity would weaken his control over the company. Daniel answered calmly that leadership built on percentages alone was fragile to begin with. In the back seat, the city lights reflected against the window beside him, and for a moment, he saw both versions of his life superimposed in the glass: the man who protected numbers at all costs, and the man who had stood beside a 19-year-old girl in the ashes of her home. When the vote was finally called to approve the temporary halt under his proposed terms, it passed by a narrow margin. Daniel knew the concession had cost him more than money. He had surrendered leverage. But as he stepped out of the car and looked back toward the darkened block, he felt something steadier than leverage settling into place. By the time Daniel walked back toward the remains of Emily's home, night had settled fully over Harbor District streetlights, casting pale circles onto cracked pavement and blackened beams. The news van had packed up, but the story was already spreading across social media headlines, debating whether his decision was courageous or reckless. Emily was still there, sitting on the edge of the curb, with her duffel bag beside her, as if she did not trust the pause to be real until she heard it directly from him. Daniel told her the board had approved a 90-day halt on the entire 12-acre redevelopment, funded in part by his own equity. He explained that during those 90 days, an independent review team would reassess structural reports, relocation packages, and legal procedures for every household on the block. He did not frame it as generosity. He framed it as accountability. Emily listened without interrupting, the streetlight catching the faint sheen in her eyes. She asked him why he had been willing to risk losing control of his company for people he had never met. Daniel answered more honestly than he ever had in a boardroom. He told her he had spent his life trying to outrun the fear he felt as a boy, watching his parents worry about losing their home, and in doing so, he had nearly become the reason someone else felt that same fear. He said wealth had insulated him from consequences, but it had not erased memory. The wind picked up slightly cool against the quiet street, and Daniel added that protecting numbers without protecting people would eventually hollow out everything he had built. Emily stood slowly stepping closer, no longer divided from him by accusation, but by shared understanding. She thanked him not for saving her, but for listening before it was too late. In the distance, the skyline shimmered towers of glass reflecting city lights, like distant constellations. Daniel looked at them and realized that for the first time in years, he did not measure their height in stories or square footage. He measured them against the simple fact that a 19-year-old girl would not be forced out by sunset. The cost was real. The consequences were unfolding. But as he stood there beneath the streetlight, he felt something stronger than fear settle into his chest. It was not triumph. It was clarity. The next morning broke cold and clear sunlight cutting across Harbor District with a sharp brightness that made every detail impossible to ignore. Temporary fencing had not gone up. Instead, a small team of independent structural engineers arrived just after 8 in the morning, clipboards in hand, not to condemn, but to reassess. Word traveled quickly along the block. Doors opened. Neighbors stepped onto porches that had not yet been cleared. For the first time since the fire, the street felt less like a countdown and more like a pause. Daniel stood beside Emily as the engineers carefully navigated the debris of her home, taking photographs, measuring support beams, documenting salvageable sections. One of them explained that portions of the foundation appeared intact and that with reinforcement, partial restoration might be possible. The statement did not promise miracles, but it offered something equally powerful possibility. Emily covered her mouth briefly, absorbing the idea that the ground beneath her feet was not automatically lost. Meanwhile, Daniel's phone continued to fill with commentary from analysts and business outlets, some praising the decision as a shift toward ethical redevelopment, others questioning whether he had jeopardized long-term growth. He did not respond to either narrative. Instead, he requested a comprehensive audit of every relocation agreement on the 12-acre site, instructing his legal team to revise compensation packages to reflect current market rates, extended timelines, and voluntary relocation, rather than accelerated displacement. The numbers were significant. Additional costs would reach into the tens of millions over the next quarter. But as revised offers were drafted, something unexpected began to happen. Community leaders who had previously opposed the project agreed to meet. Local officials expressed cautious support for a redevelopment plan that prioritized phased construction instead of immediate clearance. Emily listened as Daniel explained the changes, still cautious, but no longer bracing for impact. She told him she had never imagined someone in his position would slow down a project for people like her. Daniel answered that slowing down did not mean abandoning progress. It meant redefining it. As the engineers concluded their initial review and scheduled follow-up inspections, the block no longer felt like ground zero for erasure. It felt like the starting point of negotiation. And standing beside the remains of a house that might yet stand again in some form. Daniel sensed that justice did not arrive in dramatic gestures alone. Sometimes it arrived in paperwork, rewritten timelines extended, and a powerful man choosing to stay long enough to listen. Over the following weeks, Harbor District transformed from a site marked for swift erasure into a place of measured reconstruction. Revised relocation agreements were delivered door to door, not mailed in impersonal envelopes, but explained in face-to-face meetings that lasted hours instead of minutes. Compensation figures increased, timelines extended beyond 90 days, and residents were given the option to return to newly built units at locked-in rates once construction eventually resumed in phases. The financial impact was immediate. Market analysts reported another dip in share value, and several major investors quietly reduced their holdings. Daniel felt the shift in boardroom dynamics during weekly meetings where questions about succession planning surfaced more frequently. Yet something else shifted as well. Local news outlets began highlighting the company's revised approach, describing it as a model for responsible urban development. Community leaders who had once organized protests now sat at the same table drafting long-term plans that included green spaces, affordable housing percentages, and preservation of certain original structures. Emily became an unexpected voice during those discussions. With her father's metal box finally recovered from beneath the damaged floorboards during a supervised inspection, she spoke about memory not as sentimentality, but as infrastructure, arguing that neighborhoods were built on relationships as much as foundations. Daniel listened carefully, recognizing in her clarity a strength that had nothing to do with wealth. The engineers ultimately determined that while most of her house required rebuilding, portions of the original foundation and front steps could be reinforced and incorporated into a new structure. When she heard that the maple tree planted the year she was born could remain untouched, she smiled fully for the first time since that morning in March. Daniel watched that smile and understood that transformation did not always arrive through grand gestures alone. It unfolded through persistence, through uncomfortable meetings, through absorbing criticism without retreat. He had given up a significant percentage of his equity to protect the pause, and whispers about his future leadership continued to circulate. But when he walked through Harbor District, now residents no longer looked at him as an outsider arriving with blueprints. They saw someone who had stayed after the cameras left, and in that steady presence, Daniel began to sense that the measure of power was no longer defined by how quickly he could build, but by how responsibly he could rebuild trust. 3 months after the pause began, Harbor District no longer resembled a battlefield of uncertainty, but a construction site guided by collaboration rather than haste. Phased redevelopment plans were finalized, allowing residents to relocate temporarily within a 2-mile radius with guaranteed return options written into binding contracts. Compensation funds had been distributed, covering moving costs, security deposits, and extended rental support measured not in weeks, but in full calendar years. The financial press continued to debate whether Daniel's strategy represented visionary leadership or dangerous idealism. Within the company, a faction of board members quietly prepared contingency plans should performance metrics fail to rebound. Daniel was aware of every whisper. He felt the weight of reduced equity each time voting power was tallied. Yet when he walked through the district now, he no longer felt like a stranger navigating resistance. He felt accountable. Emily's new home, built partially on the reinforced original foundation, began to take shape, with framing rising carefully around the preserved front steps. The maple tree still stood beside the sidewalk, leaves rustling in the late spring breeze, a living bridge between what had been and what would be. Emily had enrolled in community college classes for the fall semester, as planned, her tuition partially supported by a scholarship fund established through a revised corporate social responsibility initiative that Daniel insisted be community-governed. She often attended planning meetings, speaking with a steadiness that earned respect from architects and city officials alike. One afternoon, as steel beams were lifted into place across the block under clear blue skies, Emily thanked Daniel not with praise but with honesty. She told him that the most important change was not the money or the pause. It was the fact that someone with power had been willing to reconsider his own assumptions in public. Daniel understood then that transformation had moved in both directions. He had begun this journey believing he was rescuing a project from reputational harm. Instead, the process had rescued him from becoming a man defined solely by profit. As cranes moved slowly against the skyline less than 2 miles away, Daniel felt neither triumph nor regret. He felt alignment, a rare sense that the structures rising around him were not only physical developments, but evidence that influence could be exercised without erasing the lives already rooted in the ground beneath them. By early autumn, the air over Harbor District carried the crisp edge of change leaves from the preserved maple tree, turning shades of amber and gold. The rebuilt homes stood with fresh siding and reinforced foundations, yet traces of the old neighborhood remained woven into their design: front steps, preserved small gardens replanted along sidewalks that stretched barely 4 feet wide. Emily moved into her new house on a clear Saturday morning, sunlight pouring across the porch that now blended past and present seamlessly. Her duffel bag, once holding everything she owned, rested empty in the hallway closet. Inside the metal box, recovered from beneath the original floorboards, her father's letters were placed carefully on a shelf no longer threatened by deadlines measured in hours. Daniel attended the small gathering of neighbors that afternoon, not as a headline, but as a participant standing without a tailored overcoat, sleeves rolled up, as he helped carry folding chairs from one yard to another. Conversations drifted around him, no longer tense but warm and practical, discussing school schedules, job opportunities, and the timeline for the final construction phase. The financial markets had stabilized, though his reduced equity remained a permanent reminder of his choice. He felt no regret when he looked at the skyline less than 2 miles away. Instead, he noticed how the towers caught the late afternoon sun and reflected it toward the district below, as if acknowledging that progress did not have to cast a shadow. Emily stepped onto her porch and thanked everyone for standing by each other when uncertainty felt overwhelming. When her eyes met Daniel's, there was no accusation, left only recognition. In that quiet exchange, he understood that the true measure of rebuilding was not found in square footage or stock recovery, but in the simple fact that a community had not been erased to make room for growth. Winter arrived gently that year, laying a thin layer of frost across rooftops that had once stood in ashes. Harbor District no longer felt like a project under scrutiny, but like a neighborhood reclaiming its rhythm. Lights glowed warmly through new windows in the early evenings, and the sidewalks echoed with familiar footsteps returning from work and school. Daniel found himself visiting without an agenda, sometimes parking a block away and walking the remaining distance, measuring progress not in reports, but in conversations. Emily had completed her first semester of community college with strong grades, balancing classes with part-time shifts at the diner. She often studied at the small kitchen table, positioned exactly where the old foundation met the new structure, a quiet reminder that her past had not been erased, but reinforced. The scholarship fund expanded beyond her, supporting several other students from the district, each selected through a panel that included community members rather than corporate executives alone. Inside the company, Daniel's influence was leaner but steadier. He no longer commanded unanimous votes, yet his leadership carried a different authority shaped by transparency. Some investors had left. Others stayed drawn by the long-term stability that trust created. On a cold evening measured at just under 30 degrees, Daniel stood beneath the maple tree, now bare but strong, and looked down the street lined with rebuilt homes. He realized that the most profound shift had occurred quietly. The fear that once drove him to outrun loss had been replaced by a willingness to confront it. In the stillness of winter air, he understood that true strength was not proven by how much one could acquire, but by what one was willing to protect when acquisition threatened to take too much. 1 year after that cold morning in March, Harbor District held a small spring festival along the same stretch of road that once stood marked for demolition. Booths lined the sidewalks, children laughed near freshly painted curbs, and the maple tree stood in full bloom, its leaves casting gentle shadows across porches that blended history with renewal. Emily stood near a modest stage set up at the end of the block, speaking confidently about community scholarships, sustainable redevelopment, and the importance of staying engaged when decisions feel distant. Her voice carried clearly through the speakers, steady and self-assured. Daniel listened from the edge of the crowd, no longer surrounded by security or executives, just another resident among many. His role within the company had evolved over the year. He remained influential, though less absolute in control, and the projects that followed Harbor District were shaped by policies that required early community consultation and transparent timelines. Investors had adjusted. Markets had stabilized. But those were no longer the measures that mattered most to him. As applause rose around Emily, Daniel looked down the street that once felt like a dividing line between power and vulnerability. Now it felt like a bridge. He understood that the most significant return on investment could not be calculated in dollars or percentages. It was found in the preservation of dignity, in the restoration of trust, and in the quiet knowledge that when faced with a choice between momentum and conscience, he had chosen to stop long enough to listen. And in that pause, something far more enduring than profit